NOI Education Services, and we are back for part 2 of our Roundtable series discussion on validation. If you haven't checked out our first video, please do go and watch that first. If you haven't, please make sure that you like and subscribe. I am lucky enough to be here today with Katya from Hawkeye Consulting and Vanessa from Prickly to Sweet. And we are talking all things assessment and validation, lots of fun. So guys, one of the things that when I saw this in the new standards, I was like, why? Why are we doing that? And that is 1.5b, which says validation for each training product on scope occurs regularly and at least every 5 years, as informed by risks to training outcomes, changes to the training product, and feedback from trainers, assessors, and industry. I hate the first line. I love the next two. And I think part of it leans on what you guys were talking about before. When we talk about a training product, do we mean a qualification? Like technically it means a qualification under the old definition. Is that still what it's going to mean? And 5 years, I think I can think of maybe half a dozen units in my, 20 years in vet that have survived 5 years. The vast majority generally have a lifespan of maybe 2 to 3 years. Why 5 years? Hate that part. Love the next bit. Informed by risks, informed by changes to training products, informed by feedback. So I'm really keen to get your thoughts on both B and C, because I think that risk assessment that then goes into C as well is really interesting and really, really important. And I think it will, the removal of taking away that whole, like, you've got to use the ASQA determination as to how many units you've got to validate, and really taking into account like a proper risk assessment approach is absolutely brilliant. But I'm very keen to hear your thoughts. Vanessa, you kicked us off before, so Katya, can you kick us off now?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I would like to see, and it comes back to those whole definitions, is what do they mean by regularly? Like how regular is regular? I think there needs to be a bit of a guidance provided on that. I could regularly go to the gym. I don't, but I could, and that might be 2 or 3 days a week. But or I could go 5 days a week. I think I need a bit more information around what regularly actually means and what they're expected to see, or what they want to see. I do like the removal of that kind of ASQA's validation tool and looking at that. I think from a risk-based approach, if I could give any guidance, I'd definitely be looking not only internal. Obviously, there are a number of factors that can be considered when you need to pull a representative sample size. Things like, current enrollments, your market performance, and funding growth, even mode of delivery. The site of delivery, are you in a high risk area? So definitely considering things like that, but then also looking at ASQA's current risk ratings for 2023 to 2024. So each year they use I suppose they do what they call an environmental scan, where they look at the vet landscape and ELICOS landscape and determine kind of areas of priority or high risk. So the current priorities at the moment are work placement, and so those components or training products that have a work-based placement component in them, such as hours or have to be demonstrated in a workplace. And they're looking at academic integrity. So that might encompass even things like having a new trainer and assessor on board if they're not, very new to that space. Do they know how to properly mark correctly? Are they, doing things the right way, advising students? So looking at things like that. And then also online delivery, is there any areas that you can improve? So I'd definitely be looking at that as well as doing it. So when you're looking at your risk base, definitely consider ASQA's risks, and very important. And I think definitely capture it in your policy. So if they're the types of risks that you're aware of and you're going to do, I suppose, consider, definitely list that in your policy. Make it really clear to ASQA, particularly now that it's stating that you need to take that risk-based approach, and definitely make it really clear in your policy. Only, though, I could give it any advice, only put it in your policy if you're actually going to do it. Like, the policy has to relate to your practices. Please don't just say that you're going to do these amazing things and you know, I say I do all these amazing things, but make sure that you're actually doing them, because it needs to be evident in the evidence that you submit. An auditor will request to see your policy, and then they'll look at your policy and go, okay, well, how does your policy align to your practices? What evidence am I seeing in the files or the documents that you've supplied? So definitely make sure that they're aligning.
I mean, just saying that I do it and then showing no evidence of it whatsoever is not sufficient.
Oh, absolutely not.
You
You'd
know, I
be
was
surprised
doing
how many
something
people
wrong.
think it is.
Love that wrap up you've given of the whole risk thing.
Oh.
I agree with everything that you said. I think that, I mean, it isn't amazing for the definitions they did provide. That's not one that's there. It's like everybody knows what reasonable adjustment is. Why are they still doing that? And yet they're introducing new terms and they're not providing new definitions. Yeah, I really hope they include that. I think regarding risk management, risk-based approach, risk assessment, risk generally as the term, I wonder if they're going to go back to like a more of an ISO standard risk analysis. And when they're talking about training their staff, that would probably be one of the first thing I would suggest you do. If you're going to be involved in any parts of these areas specifically, make sure you've got trained people in understanding what risk is. And it might be risk to a team, or it might be risk to the whole organization, or it might be a risk to a whole industry. So the basic risk requirements of safety is generally also something that needs to be considered. But you had a huge list. That was fantastic. I should have been writing all these down.
Yeah, I think
it's very interesting. We've got like, because we take a similar approach. We've got basically a list of all of the different risks that a product could engage in. We've got a point system that allocates to each of those risks. And then based on, you know, like how many points you add up, that's going to correlate to either high risk, medium risk, or low risk. And that's going to determine, that's kind of basically determined how regular we consider regular, right? That's been the trigger for how we've determined regularity. And anytime that we haven't seen a definition in the standards that has looked like, I guess, what I would call like a trigger word, we've kind of gone, okay, until something comes out and tells us that this is what it's going to be, this is how we're going to define it. This is our rationale for how we've defined it, and this is how we're going to action it. So we've just gone through and like finished our entire policy procedure update, with the exception of the trainer policy, because no credential policy out yet. But that's kind of the approach that we've taken. And I think it is very interesting, like when you look at the scope of risk within an organization, and, you know, like all of those things that you pointed out, is it a safe, you know, like at the end of the day, can the student do it safely, or is there a serious risk if they get it wrong, you know? You know, the newness of the trainer, you know, so you got to take into account the cohort, the assessment tool, you know, it's such a complex, it's such a complex beast. It's interesting that they've brought all of that in, and I do think that that's going to speak to a stronger focus on it, you know, in aspect. Like one of the things that comes through all of this, in context of like the 1.1 and the learner well-being and everything like that, I think is all going to come down to how are you doing all of this, keeping in mind who your learner is and what your learner's needs are.
Yeah.
And that's going to be I think that's going to be a really interesting one, is like, because even when we validate, you know, we're thinking about validation in terms of doesn't meet the training product. But I think that last bit of feedback from learners, trainers, assessors, and industry is going to start to take into account things like, okay, so you validated it and it might be compliant. Is it usable?
Which brings into the testing component too. Like, are they looking at testing and actually using on your first cohort and actually documenting evidence of that? And
wasn't there a discussion about that?
Yeah,
was that in the previous one that it actually said it had to be after a certain period of time or straight after you've done your first cohort?
Yeah, so the TAE requirement says that you've got to do validation following completion of training and assessment of your first learner cohort.
That's a
and the
validation in terms of validation of assessment judgments from my reading, not validate like pre-validation.
Yeah,
Yes.
agreed.
But I think that you know, I mean, we've probably all seen assessment tools that are compliant, right? In terms of their design, right? Technically, if you had all the time in the world to run them out, you could produce a compliant result from that tool. That's very different to having an assessment tool that's usable. Like I know, Vanessa, your system, if it comes up with 100%, that's actually a red flag because it's like, dude, you just copied and pasted so much of this unit, it's not funny, right?
Yeah.
A unit can be compliant and not usable, right?
Oh, yeah.
We get
Yeah.
that in, like, we see that all the time is they'll kind of go, okay, but all you've got to do to fill this assessment tool out is, you know, the trainer's got to write a paragraph for each learner on what they did, and they've got to write a comment against everything that they observed. And we've got to just tick these 27,000 tick boxes. And, you know, and it's only going to take each trainer about an hour and a half to mark each of these assessments. And you're going, you mean an hour and a half when there's 25 students in a large commercial kitchen and they're only in there for 4 hours? Yeah. Okay, do you see the problem with that? Like, it's compliant, don't get me wrong, but I think that one of the things that I would like to see, and I think that bringing in all of the training and stuff and bringing in the feedback more is going to be, are we creating usable tools? Are we creating, you know, are we creating something that is actually, when we say fit for purpose, right? What is fit for purpose?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important too, Lauren, you mentioned about the hours and you use the commercial cookery example, and it's a great example because it's actually something that auditors pick up on in an audit. They'll go, well, this assessment tool, you know, would roughly take about 2 hours to mark. However, you've only put 1 hour in your training and assessment strategy for that. So your volume of learning is out. And how can one trainer do it when you've got a capacity of, or you've stated in your training schedule that you're going to have a capacity of 10 students in that kitchen? And if each one is 1 hour, how can the assessor see them in the 6 hour period that you've blocked them in for? So it's something really important to consider because auditors do look for it. And it kind of, to me, it makes common sense, but to a lot of people, I think they tend to forget that. It's that practicality. Will this actually work? Will you actually be able to deliver it the way that it is stated in that tool?
Not if they want to foster an inclusive environment for their well-being.
Our students want to enjoy it too. You want students to come back. The best way of building your RTO is through your students. They're the ones who are living that experience. If they're not enjoying the training or then the assessments too, you know, onerous or it's boring and they're not enjoying it, then I think that's also something you need to consider.
And 1.1 now very clearly says you've got to create training materials and training resources that motivate and engage learners, which is, you know, look, as long as ASPA stays happy and nice, as long as ASPA stays happy and workable and with the attitude that they've got now, I'm okay with that. It's best practice. If we come against a mad auditor, like an angry auditor, and they go to audit that, all cheese and crackers, are there going to be some debates and discussions and healthy disagreements that occur?
Your motivation might be completely different to my motivation. Like, how do we measure that? It's definitely, you know, it's subjective.
Especially in an online environment too. How do you determine somebody's engagement in an online situation? Is it the amount of time it takes? Because it shouldn't be, because people go at a different pace regarding completion of things. Are we going, because there's no indication of the ability to utilize digital or AI applications that can identify eye movement on a screen as engagement. I mean, there are so many open boxes in that you go, well, I hope they're going to be a little bit more of what's considered engaged.
I think that boils down to, as well, keeping in mind that we've got this vet market of, you know, highly experienced professionals with 3 or 4 degrees who are undertaking professional development. Therefore, online makes the most sense to them. They don't want to come out and rock up in person. And you've also got 15-year-olds who dropped out of school 3 years ago, who are now doing a hands-on pre-apprenticeship trade. And unless you've physically got them in a room, you know, you've got Buckley's chance of engaging them. So I think this is where the 1.2, knowing your cohort and designing for your cohort, is really going to come into play. But I think this is where validation is going to kind of go, is going to be, you know, validation is that kind of summation of like all of our policies and processes. Have we brought them all together to create a product that makes sense for our learners, that meets the unit of competency, and it's been actioned by all the right people, and it's created the right product? Like I know that with our trainers, when we check what our trainers have done, we like to see about an 80% completion rate, right? Maybe around about the 90-95 when it comes to units of competency, but I actually don't want to see a trainer who has 100% completion rate for every one of their students. That's generally a little bit of a red flag for me, because I'm like, so, okay, but generally you're going to come across a learner every so often that's just really not capable of doing the unit, even if we've gone through all the right checks at enrollment, you know. And by the same token, I don't want to see a trainer with 20% completions and kind of going, well, what's going on here? Are they getting so bored that they're dropping out? Are you actually over assessing them? You know, like, what's your cohort that you're dealing with? So my job seeker trainers might have very different rates than my trainee trainers. And my trainee trainers, if you're working in a high turnover industry, you might have a lot of drop-offs because you train retail and hospitality. They have high drop-off rates, you know, for trainees and apprentices and things like that. But is validation not kind of an RTO's, is, you know, kind of the open door to your kind of key quality indicator, right?
I think it should be. I mean, and following on that, geez, there is no indication about the quality indicators in this, unless I've missed it. Please tell me it's gone, because I can't see it. The other thing I wanted to identify was the fact, because it's so focused on feedback, I mean, wouldn't it make sense to lots of providers to immediately identify their feedback process and say, did you feel engaged? And if you've already got an indication that students are engaged, there's the evidence that they're engaged. It doesn't say you can't.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely something like that should form part of it, but whether an auditor would be fully satisfied that a student just take the like self-declaration, that's probably something we may start to uncover as we go through this with clients and see what they're actually going to do when they go to audit. But I think it would need to be a bit more of a robust system, just from what I've been exposed to in the past and what I've seen and how they audit. I do think it would need to be a bit more robust. That definitely is like a little cherry on the top. You can say, oh, they've actually gone and done that, and what better than a self-declaration? But I think having all of those other touch points along the student journey. So looking at that student model that they're currently auditing providers against, and go, okay, where from each stage are we gaining feedback? And how are we using that feedback to better inform our practices? And I think that, along with self-declarations and capturing that, and the QI data, if it's, I actually don't know if it's still there. That's a good question. But it would be good to actually capture all of it and make sure that you're documenting it too. Like if you are doing something, trying to capture that evidence, because if we don't have, you know, something that shows that occurred, then again it comes back to, oh well, how do I know you actually did this?
It always comes down, if you haven't written it down, it didn't happen.
That could be great where AI or even automation could come in. There could be that, you know, automated touch points or workflows along that student journey that is allowing to capture that. So bring it all together.
Yeah, and then it feeds into your risk assessment. Like there's so many possibilities. We could just create a whole new system just sitting here talking about it. I wanted to ask you ladies, because you did touch on this, Katya, about the amount of training. They've actually removed that from the wording so that they're focused in this area regarding engagement and stuff, that they're saying it's a consistent, like knowledge is consistent with the training product, that they're talking about. What was the other thing they said?
Training, practice, instruction, practice, feedback, and assessment is
yeah. So
kind
they
of
said they're
within the new
replacing
1.1.
Yeah, they're replacing the concept of amount of training, which the sector identified as confusing. Volume of learning, amount of training, you put the two together, let's just make a whole.
And don't even get started on nominal hours when people start bringing that
Right.
in.
Yeah. And then it says that they're requiring the RTOs to ensure it provides sufficient time for instruction, practice, feedback, and assessment. I mean, all of those are touch points for engagement when you start really thinking about it.
What was the pace? And I think there are even questions in the current AQF anyway. Like, how did you find the pace of the course? I could be wrong, but I think so. Definitely capturing that. And even in getting that from industry as well. Like what they would be realistic and mapping that's one of those intertwining ones that you could incorporate. So they're getting it from both like learners and then also industry, what they expect would be relevant. I think, yeah, I do like that. And the volume of learning stepping away from that, because most providers don't, in some instances, don't meet it. So it's confusing and
it's not appropriate anyway. It's just not appropriate because you've got a Cert 3, which is 48 units designed to be delivered over 4 years, massive complexity in the UEE training package, and you've got 10 units from the SIR training package, that realistically it should never take more than 6 months to roll out that training, regardless of the learner delivery. So it had to go. Right, had to go.
We're happy with that one. Done.
Yes, we got one positive. That's good.
I think the design, that whole design element is going to feed into, how are we designing our courses? How are we then designing our assessments based on the courses and the modes of delivery and the learner cohorts that we're working with? And then, as I said, a validation hopefully is kind of the summation, the summation review of how all of that component works. And when I think about an assessment system, as you said, like this is validation of an assessment system, and so it is all of those different components. And I would hope that the reason why they've focused on people making those determinations is because the people are responsible for making sure that we are taking into account feedback from learners, feedback from trainers, feedback from assessors, feedback from industry, all of the different risk mitigation components that, that we need to take into account in order to realistically work out kind of an overarching system. I do want to go into another part. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break, guys, and we're going to be back in 5 minutes, and you're going to be back in 3 days to continue watching this series. If you want to find more from Vanessa or Katya, you can check out their links below. You can follow them on socials. You can see all the good stuff that they put out there. And of course, if you follow our interview series, we've got a whole bunch with the Divine Miss M. We've got some great content coming out with Katya and Alicia. Thank you so much, guys. My name is Lauren Hollows from NOI Education Services.